You are now relearning economics.
Welcome back to the live stream. We have moved our stream from Steve's channel to my channel. We don't know if anybody's going to show up, so make sure you say hi in the chat. This could be our last show, right? If nobody shows up, we're not going to do this anymore. So I don't mean to start on a bad note, but that's where we're at. Make sure if you got questions, basically the point of this show is to have questions. We can put that ticker up right now. I made it red so it really stands out. So if you have questions, get them in. I'll get Steve to answer them. Maybe it's a question. Hey guys, perfect. There, we got some people are here. If you got questions for Steve specifically, just put in Steve. That way I don't try to answer them and butcher them. But if you've got like a system dynamic question, that's my wheelhouse. I live in that world. So you can do that. We were supposed to have Robert Hockett with us today. I don't know where he is. It is what it is. We'll put the messages out and hopefully he joins us. Christopher, I'm doing great today. What a perfect day. We do this Fridays now, so I'm into it. I'm not like so we used to do it on Saturdays, right? So I was hungover, right? I like to have a couple beers on Friday night. And it was tough to keep up with the brilliance of Steve Keynes. So we've moved this to Friday now, and so I'm into this stuff right now. So I'm gonna bring on Steve, the man, Dr. Steve Keynes, as I call him now. We've renamed the stream Mr. Keynes and Dr. Keynes, the live stream, or Dr. Keen, putting an S on your name, but it's a good play on words. What do you think,
It's a
Steve?
good play on words. I mean, this is one reason that I use, when people talking about forming an institute. I was looking to send an email to Robert, by the way, as we chat here. So I was sending him the link for Restream. But one reason I use my name for things like the proposed Keen Institute is because it's a good name. I mean, I can thank my parents for having a clever name. The number of times people have said to me, "God, you're keen." If I had $1 for each of those, I'd probably be rich enough to start the Keen Institute on my own. But equally, people have accused me of, being pleased that my name is almost Keynes. Well, your name is Keynes. So the perfect combo is Keen and Keynes. And we've got to write a book one of these days with those two names in the title.
Yeah, it would be something pretty special if we did that.
Mm.
Christopher, I'm a member of Steve's Rebel Economist Challenge. What will subscribing to your Patreon add on top? I'm not too sure, like how much more money I'm going to get each month, if that's what you mean.
Well, on that front, I can answer Christopher on that front, and that is that I may have designed Rebel and Minsky behind it, but Ty's the best modeler, period, far better than me. I built far more elaborate models. They look far better than mine do because you care about the layout and you do things with the layout that takes an enormous amount of labor right now because we don't have labor saving tricks like, selecting a bunch of icons and left aligning or right aligning, and you do all that yourself. So your models look gorgeous and you've taken on far more complex modeling processes than I've taken on so far. The main thing is your applied MMT model brings together everything I've done and bits and pieces that I've done on different topics. You've put together in an integrated way. So if you were to really want to learn from a aficionado of system dynamics, then subscribing to Ty's channel would be a good idea.
As for what you get, there's 4 levels, Christopher. You can I think that my cheapest one's like $4 a month, maybe $5 a month. And you'll get the blogs. Like my most recent blog was if the banker was designed under a free floating exchange rate system, something Steve covered a few weeks ago. I decided to take a little further to see how that works. So blogs like that, you can go up in higher membership, and that's where I start giving away little toy models. Something I've always found, if you want to learn, at least for me, if you want to learn something and it's maybe physical or virtually physical, if you get a piece, that toy, and then you take it and you break it and then put it back together, that's how you learn things. So that's how I've always advocated to take my models, break them, learn how they work, learn the structure, learn feedbacks. And also I've got a lot of digital books that I'll give to my Patreon members that I shouldn't give away, but I do anyways, that were written by other people. So it is what it is. We got a question here, Steve. It's going to be our first one on the Relearning Econ channel. This is a good one. Have
Yep.
either of you built a systems dynamic model that models inflation, Steve?
Yeah, well, in fact, Kevin, that's one thing. Kevin's one of the members of the school online class that I lecture, and he's probably putting more effort than anybody else into mastering modeling and Ravel, both for data analysis and for economic modeling. But yeah, the basic thing I did way back in my PhD, I think Russ probably, I imagine that Ty knows more about this than I do these days, is I had a lag convergence to equilibrium aggregate price level added to the model. And this is all working from Kolesky's decomposition of what causes inflation, to say that if you start from having a price level times real output, and you then argue that a certain fraction of real output goes to wages, and then you have a certain amount of output per worker, you can ultimately derive that the price level is equal to the markup on money wages divided by output per worker. And that then means your inflation calculation is simply the rate of change of inflation is the rate of change of markups plus the rate of change of money wages minus the rate of change of labor, the labor output to labor ratio. And that, when you add it to the system, that gives you some, it shows the importance of putting together an integrated system completely. Because let's say you add that to the basic model that Richard Goodwin put forward, where you basically had workers and capitalists, and that was it. You had no bankers in the system. There was no debt, etc., etc. If you add that price equation to the model, so you've got as well as having real output, which is a function of the amount of capital installed, and so you've got a real production system as part of the argument. If you also have prices turning up, so profit is prices times output minus wage costs, then you get that adding the prices to the Goodwin model rapidly stabilizes it. So rather than the continuous cycles of Goodwin, you converge to equilibrium. But if you include money inside there, then you get a debt deflation. Because if you have the bankers, if capitalists are borrowing to invest, and because they're borrowing, you always borrow in current dollars, you then accumulate debt on that basis. And if you have deflation, the deflation increases the debt burden, and that can lead to a debt deflation. So I've done those models, and I think that's part of your applied MMT model, isn't it, too?
Yeah, the only
Yeah.
only difference is instead of treating the markup parameter as a constant, it's variable in the system. So depending
Yeah.
on profits, the markup will adjust over time. And so what we found is firms will actually mark up more aggressively during times of high profits, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to lower profits in aggregate. So essentially, it's the same thing. And also, another thing, in the larger, we call it deep Minsky. But maybe it is the Minsky model now. Everybody always asks Steve, "Hey, can I get a hold of this Minsky model?" Because they think Minsky is a model. It's not the.
Rather than a modeling platform. Yeah.
But anyways, maybe it is the Minsky model. But other things that keep the system stable is actually the financial sector does pay an income to households over time. So you can get debt deflation out of the large model if you set parameters a certain way. But in a lot of ways, it's stabilized by the fact that the financial sector is generating wealth for the household sector over time. But anyways, essentially, yeah, at its core, that's exactly what I use. And I've built little standalone models to kind of prove that Kolesky was on the money as with defining inflation that way. And there's obviously a ton of theories of inflation. So anyways, what's going on? Oh,
This New Haven, this might actually be a call from Robert. Let's just find out. I'll answer it and see
let's
whether
do this live.
Is this Robert?
Hi, Steve. Yeah, it's Robert. Hey, Steve. For some reason, the link isn't working. I don't know if you got
Oh,
the
okay. Well,
that I just sent.
okay. Well, we'll send it back to your email again. I'll say it is Robert. So I'll copy the link to your email again, Robert. It should work.
Okay, I'll get off and check the email again.
Okay. Here we go. Okay. Bye.
All right.
This is mixing your communication systems.
Maybe
So,
maybe I don't know. If you're here, then I've given the right link. So
yeah, well, I think I'm not quite certain why his link didn't work, but we'll see. I'm sending it to his Gmail, and hopefully he'll join us in a moment, which would be wonderful.
okay, we've got what's Dr. T saying here? Just a random observation. In an hourly supervision at Cambridge, we were taught the exam for 55 minutes. Then our supervisor, post-Keynesian, before it was a thing, said, "Here's 5 minutes real stuff." What are you talking about, Dr. T?
That's pretty much what that's a situation of somebody who is a realist but is working at a fantasy economics department like Cambridge is these days. Cambridge is actually the heart of realistic economics under Joan Robinson and Schaffer and Kaldor and Koleski and so on, and Keynes before that. But the neoclassicals have taken over. They don't even know their own history. They don't even, most of the neoclassicals there wouldn't know that there used to be a center of non-orthodox thought in economics. But yeah, that's what I was doing so many times. I'd teach the mainstream stuff so students could pass the exam, and then I'd say, now here's why that's bullshit. So it's a painful fate, because I mean, the analogy I always make is we're like a bunch of Galilean astronomers in centers dominated by Ptolemaic astronomers who believe the Earth is the center of the universe. And there's Robert.
Hey,
G'day,
guys,
mate.
how are you?
Hi, hooray, welcome in.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry about that broken link before. It looks like we're all set now.
There you are, indeed. Yeah.
This work. I'm going to try to take this outside on the back deck here. If I get staticky or something like that, please let me know, and I'll come back in here. The cabin that I inhabit is sort of being worked on, and so everything is in a bit of an unfinished state. And I think the natural background behind me on the deck will be more pleasant as long as the internet signal remains strong.
Okay, let's see how you go. All right.
There you
Yep.
go.
Oh, that's
How's that
very
looking?
nice. Oh,
that looks like something worth getting money right for, doesn't it?
we're envious.
Preserving
We're
that
envious
environment.
Let's
already.
make this bigger. There we
there
go.
you
Look
go.
at that.
Oh,
Look
lovely,
at
lovely,
that.
lovely. There we are.
Oh,
See?
I have to say, your background is about as wild as your hair. They're both very,
Yeah,
and they're both very natural.
there's an influence here, right? I suppose, you know, you look at the trees, they're not manicured, so why should I be?
Exactly. Is that a house? I understand. Did you build that place?
I wish I could claim to have built it, but a friend built it,
Okay.
or at least a friend built the shell. And so what's going on is, with the help of some contractors, over the last 2.5 years, I've been sort of little by little rendering it habitable. So first, the plumbing was put in, the septic tank, the whole sort of bathroom shower sort of setup. It was, of course, electrified. Lately, the insulation has finally been completed, which comes in handy in upstate New York in the wintertime. So fully insulated now, including, you know, roof, floor, and walls. And so it's becoming, I think, you know, quite habitable, but it's still not what I would call civilized looking inside. For one thing, the rooms are all sort of staging areas. And for another thing, you know, the walls aren't finished. Things aren't really painted up yet. Only the bathroom has been done as a kind of, almost as a kind of lost leader, or essentially as an inspiration to sort of show what the place might look like once it's actually finished. So
Well, best of luck in getting there. Yeah.
But it was the advantage about buying just basically a shell like this is that, you know, you could buy something all cash here in upstate New York for, you know, 4 or 5 figures. And it's on a pretty big chunk of land, which is moreover adjacent to a national forest. So it does feel as if you are essentially inhabiting a kind of not yet conquered wilderness or something. So I guess that's certainly tranquilizing in a good sense.
I could do with some tranquilizer myself at the moment. The only we get weed rather than trees in Amsterdam for tranquilizers. So.
Well, that's out here too. I'm not a partaker yet. Maybe never will be. I don't know. But there are an awful lot of California ex-hippies who have moved out here of late because it's cheaper. So yeah, so I'm finding, and of course, the lovely thing about that is these people make me feel young as well, right? Because they're literal ex-hippies. I mean, they were hippies when Jim Morrison was alive, you know, and so these people call me things like young man, which is not something I.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I don't hear that
Yeah.
often anymore. So.
Well, the young man, you're being asked to introduce yourself right now. Who is this guest this week? So let's have a rave about what you do and what your claims to fame are, apart from living in a shack in the upstate New York. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if I have a claim to fame, but what my day job and my moonlighting jobs are as follows. I'm the Edward Cornell Professor of Law and Finance over at Cornell, on the one hand, and I previously worked over at the New York Fed, downtown, Lower Manhattan, and at the International Monetary Fund over in DC on the other hand. So, and I still do sort of occasional consulting work for those entities. In addition to that, I suppose if I'm known at all, it's probably known. I'm probably known for a lot of the work that I've done for some of the more progressive members of the U.S. Congress. So I was Bernie Sanders's finance policy spokesperson in the 16 and 20 campaigns, and have drafted quite a bit of legislation for him.
Mm-hmm.
Similar.
We have a freeze here. Ty, are you okay?
I'm okay, but
yeah, Robert, yeah, might be getting to go back inside. Unfortunately, let's see. That's a long freeze.
That's a great picture. I remember the last time he was on, he had some great hair, and I made sure to take a screenshot.
Yeah, I think this actually looks a serious freeze. Unfortunately, I was hoping he does, because he's a legal scholar who understands money, and that's very rare. The only other, well, there's several others of status, but Christine DeSand is probably the one who's most prominent. Let's hope he can make it back. We're going to be maybe get the bathroom view this time.
I wonder what he did at the Fed. I'm kind of interested.
Well, let's get some background once he comes back on again. Yeah, but he's one of the people who he's recognized in MMT as a person who understands and promotes MMT. They're coming from the legal point of view and seeing how money evolved out of legal practices, which is something that economists aren't normally particularly cluey about. Let's see if he sent me an email of what's actually happened there. No luck. We lost him for a while, but he should be here in a moment with a bit of luck. Yeah. So we got any other questions? And so the IMF and the Fed, two institutions Keynes, the heterodox economists love. Yeah, that's. I mean, this is one of the funny things about these institutions. You can find people who aren't professional economists who actually know what they're talking about, which is the opposite to the professionals who don't know what they're talking about. So, for example, one of the people that I used to quote incessantly was a guy called Alan Holmes, who was the senior vice president of the New York Fed in the 1950s and 60s. And he was one of the many people in those institutions who work on the actual practicality of the monetary system. And you're making sure that the open market operations are sufficient to be able to have enough reserve funds or settlement funds on hand to buy each weekly bond sale. That's one of the technical aspects of the Fed's operations that the accountants understand and the economists don't. But if you don't do that, then you might have not enough reserves to buy the available bonds. So the Fed then goes and buys enough bonds or existing bonds of current bondholders to generate settlement accounts for those same bondholders that are sufficient that they're going to be able to overbid 2 or 3 times to buy the new bonds that are being issued. Wow, how strange. The new bonds get sold, and then the whole process goes on. So they understand the actual mechanics. And Alan Holmes was horrified by Milton Friedman's monetarist argument, saying you could control the rate of money, growth of the money supply, and therefore control the rate of inflation and the rate of economic activity. And I'll find the actual quote in a moment, but as much as I can go from memory, he said that the argument that you can control the rate of growth of the money supply suffers from the naive, and he'll actually use the word naive, the naive belief that that effectively reserves are needed to lend. And then he said, in the real world, banks make loans, creating money in the process, and look for the reserves later. So people like Holmes, who is senior vice president for the Fed, he knew what was going on. He was right. And all the economist types, the Vocklers and so on, I never pronounced Vockler's name properly, but who cares? They and Bernanke as well do not understand the monetary dynamics. So you can get people like Robert and people like Robert Alan Holmes all those years ago, understanding what happens, and the others are all wrong. And we've lost Robert again. Any sign or no sign yet?
No sign whatsoever.
Oh, damn, what a drag. Okay. We've got 10 people watching, and we've lost our special guest, and we ain't got any particularly tough questions yet. So
get your questions in. I know quite a few because I put this feed on Steve's X Twitter account. If you're over there, get your questions in there, or come over to at relearning econ. That's my channel. That's what it is. And you can ask your questions here. It's a little bit easier in the interface. Steve, because I'm on my Shrafa trip right now in economics, and you were going to tell me some more things about Shrafa and the, what did you call it? Sraffian?
Sraffian.
Sraffian.
Yeah, I mean, you got some complicated names. Keynesian was fairly easy, but Sraffa was his name, Sraffa. So how do you handle that? In putting an English label on it, comes Sraffi, and like if people say Keen, it'll be Keen-ian, etc., etc. Christopher's saying, Chris, what was, you said a funny admission interview with the professors from Chicago. Do you want to give us a bit more detail on that? Because we're feeling here, haven't got our audience, we've lost our guest speaker. We're not doing well at the moment. So yeah, it'd be intriguing to see what the interview was. I've sent Robert, and let's just hope he comes back and goes to calls us from inside the shack rather than outside. I'll just let's hope he turns up, and maybe if in the countryside he might be completely wiped out. Electronica. So Sraffa, you want to know about Sraffa? Okay, let's go back quite a way, because Sraffa was an academic I don't know whether he's an academic or not, but he was an activist and intellectual in Italy who wrote a very detailed investigation of the Italian banking system. And that caught Keynes's eye, so Keynes invited him to come across to Cambridge. And he was, so when he came across to Cambridge, he was, he's had an incredible capacity to be empirically realistic, which makes you extremely rare in economics in general. So his analysis of he analyzed the 1925 banking crisis in Italy, and that was the paper that got Keynes's attention. So Keynes got him to come to England at the time. He was also, by the way, a friend of Gramsci, and he used to visit Gramsci in jail all the time, keeping Gramsci sane with visits when he was imprisoned. So a very widely based human being, not just an academic, but quite a wide. Here you go, Robert. You've gone to the car, have you?
Should we try once more? I don't know. This is so strange. The internet is usually quite good. The only one time have I had a problem with it this year, and that was when a tornado struck a few weeks ago.
Oh,
so I thought, okay, well maybe the connection will be better in the driveway. So here I am in the driveway, in the car.
Okay.
And if this fails, I guess we can always try again. I'll be at my place in the city, in New York City, pretty soon. So we could try again there if this.
So actually, I was actually as you got cut off there, when you said you worked at the New York Fed. Well, I love monetary operations and the structure of the economy. That's kind of my bread and butter and how I model things. What did you do at the Fed? What was your job?
Well, there were a couple of things. The thing that occasioned my going there in the first place was after when the crash occurred in 2008. There was a bit of internal soul searching that they did, and they actually brought on a consultant from several consultants from various business schools, these sort of putative sort of management experts, to do a kind of an internal diagnosis to sort of figure out what had gone wrong. How did they miss it? Now, they might have just talked to you, Ty, and to Steve and asked about whether their DSGE models, which didn't include money or banking or any other kind of money generating financial institution, whether that might have had something to do with it. But they didn't. Instead, what they decided, which I suppose was complementary to that, was that there had been too much groupthink internally, that they didn't have anybody dissenting, nobody sort of suggesting that maybe the models could do with a bit of an updating or a bit of a kind of a reality check, as they say. And remember, this had been during the Greenspan era, even though it was Geithner's New York Fed. And so, my understanding is that Greenspan was pretty good at imposing a kind of, policy of ad terrorem on everybody. Everybody was sort of terrorized anyway.
Yeah.
So what they recommended was the establishment of a sort of contrarian thinking department within the institution itself. Or as I like to think of it, they suggested the establishment of a sort of an asshole department of people who would say, "Hey, are you sure that's right? What do you think? I mean, are you missing something here? Hey, wait, why are you doing that?" Basically what a New Yorker might call a nudge.
Yeah.
Up and some asshole over at Cornell.
And you got the job. Okay, lucky you.
So yeah, they asked me to come in and sort of help set that up. As it turned out, it never ended up being a full department that was more than one person. It was just a one-person asshole / department. And so that was the overall job. When it came to sort of individual things that they would sort of put me on, one was to help develop the so-called macroprudential toolkit, which was at that point kind of in the process of being constructed, I suppose you could say, by some contrarian thinking, at least relative to the U.S. Baseline economists. I had for quite some time been on record as being on the so-called lean side of the lean versus clean debate when it came to central bank monetary policy. That was unusual for an American, and even to some extent for a North American, even though Bill White, of course, was Canadian. But, for a continental European or for anybody else, I suppose, out there in the world, somebody like you guys, that wasn't a particularly radical sort of position. It was just common sense. But because it was a sort of an outlier position among American thinkers back in those days, I guess they sort of saw me as kind of, I guess, at the front end or whatever. And so I helped put that macroprudential toolkit together. They had me sort of map out scenarios as to what would happen to contracts worldwide if there was some kind of a euro event. For example, Greece's departure from the Eurozone, or maybe Germany's departure from the zone. Various things of that kind. So it was overall pretty satisfying. People were much more welcoming, not just of me as a person, but even of somewhat, outlier ideas than I had expected. This might be partly because Geithner himself had moved on. Of course, Obama had named him Treasury Secretary, and so now Bill Dudley had become the president. And while Dudley, an old Goldman Sachs economist, had a reputation as somebody who doesn't suffer fools gladly, either he decided that I wasn't a fool, or he underwent some kind of change, because he was very welcoming of the sort of out-of-the-box ideas that I was always kind of throwing out.
Yeah. What about the economists themselves? What was the story with them? Did the economists in general talk to you? Or did they treat you as an outsider and just nod to you at the coffee shop and that was it? Oh, no, we've got another freeze here. Oh,
that's okay.
This is fascinating.
Okay.
I'd love to get more detail from him.
Hold on. Let's. So Kevin gave a good suggestion here. Let me get him back on.
Yeah, without the video, unfortunately. Oh, you're back again. Good. Yeah.
Robert.
Yeah,
yeah. Maybe just try turning off your video, and really you're giving us a wealth of information just speaking. So if you turn off the video, it might save some bandwidth. Now, can you still speak and talk to us?
Okay.
Okay, there you are.
Yeah, not as good as seeing you live, but still better to have your voice coming in than nothing at all.
So Steve was asking, how did the economists at the Fed treat you while you were there?
Oh, no.
so badly that he had to log off.
That's right. Yeah, terrible. Okay. Yeah.
So bad. Hold on. Hold on, he's
Yeah.
back.
I moved closer to the modem.
Oh, that might work. That'll work. That's a good
Yeah.
idea. Yeah. If in doubt,
Maybe
sit on
that'll
the
work.
modem. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we'll try. I turned off the video as you suggested, Ty, and I'm closer to the modem. I'm getting an indicator that the signal is stronger. Maybe that's good.
Yeah.
I suppose we'll see. Keeping the fingers crossed.
So Steve was asking, how were you treated by like the economists? You know, the
Oh,
economists in the room at the Fed while you were there.
yeah. So this was interesting as well. Even those who had a reputation as being rather conservative, or kind of more Chicago or George Mason, say, or so-called fresh water than salt water, were surprisingly welcoming too, and not just personally speaking, but even idea wise, they seemed to be. And I couldn't help but think maybe they had been somewhat humbled or chastened by what had happened, in the lead up to
Mm.
2008 and then '08. Here's a case in point. You guys might remember that in 2010, I started hawking an idea to deal with the underwater mortgage crisis. And that involved cities using their eminent domain authority to engage
Oh,
in
yeah.
compulsory purchases of underwater mortgage loans,
Yep.
and to finance those purchases essentially with money that would be supplied by the actual beneficial owners of the loans, right? Essentially because the securitization contracts were the problem. They didn't allow for actual write downs, even when these would be value enhancing by lowering default risk. But this was considered a kind of radical idea by lots of right wingers or conservatives because they viewed it as somehow a threat in principle to the very idea of property rights. I guess they thought their
Mm.
children would be taken next. So all of the industry organizations like SIFMA, right, and the Mortgage Bankers Association and the like, were all crying bloody murder. Wall Street Journal was naming me by name on the
All right.
on their op-ed page, calling me a communist and complaining. Had to testify before various congressional committees and so forth. And in the midst of all this, some of the more conservative economists who actually run the website, including current issues in economics and finance at the New York Fed, invited me to do a write-up explaining and defending the plan.
Okay.
This was in 2013, and so they posted it. And of course, that brought them all sorts of opprobrium from conservative entities like the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, which attacked the Fed mercilessly for giving airtime or giving a forum to the communist who happened also to be working there. So that, I mean, I have to say that came as something of a surprise, right? It made me sort of think, all right, maybe I had these guys wrong, because I had certain conceptions of what they must be like before I went there. One other example, during the occupation of Zuccotti Park, which is just a
Oh,
couple
yeah.
of blocks away, I would camp out at the park each night, then go back to my flat, shower, get dressed again, and then do my day job over at the Fed during the day. So I was sort of backing and forthing. It was, you might think of it as a recipe for schizophrenia of some sort, but in fact, all of the economist types and other folk over at the New York Fed would come to my office each day and ask how it was going. And you could tell that they weren't just morbidly curious, like, oh, what's that freak show like over there? But rather, they seemed really sympathetic. They really seemed to want to know. So, I don't know if it's entirely like that still at this point over there, but certainly during the time that I was there and for sometime thereafter, when all of my old friends and colleagues who I'd made there were still there, it was a much more open-minded, free spirit of inquiry sort of place than I had expected before I landed over there in 2010.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because I mean a common phenomenon of the financial crisis was that central banks realized they'd got something badly wrong, and they
Mhm.
started to do something. At least they had to admit they made a mistake,
Yeah.
and and that's like I experienced that when I was working with not employed by but working at the Bank of England with people like Michael Kumoff and so on. So
Yeah.
do you know Michael at all?
I do. He was over at the IMF when I was there.
Mm,
I did two stints at the IMF. One was right out of law school. It was my first job, apart from the appellate clerkship. That's always like a rite of passage.
yeah,
And then and he wasn't there then. But then the second time was during my first sabbatical from Cornell. After I'd been
yeah.
at Cornell for a while, I was entitled to a sabbatical right after getting tenure. So I went over and took a year to work over at my old digs. An interesting sort of side story there that Michael was sort of a part of as well was in my first stint, there was no monetary and capital markets division at the IMF. And so I had worked in the legal department. And at the time, I'd always said, they really, this is crazy that there's not like a monetary and financial markets department here at the IMF of all places.
Of all places,
They really, they ought to have one. And then, of course, one was indeed established after I left there to finish up my doctoral work and then take up my academic post. And so when I went back during my sabbatical, they assigned me to that department as well as the legal department. So I was kind of jointly appointed in those two departments. In any event, I got to know Michael pretty well at that time because he and I saw things pretty much the same way.
Yeah.
And that too was an interesting sort of education for me because what that indicated or what that signaled to me was that the IMF had also become a much more open-minded, much more kind of free-thinking place in the interim than it had been during my first stint there, because I couldn't have imagined a Michael Kumhoff being there during my first stint. It was much more hidebound or too hidebound for that sort of thing. But of course now, once they brought me back, it was a very different institution.
It's complicated though. Like, was that when Olivier Blanchard was head of the research division of the IMF?
Trying to remember.
Before.
I think it was before. I'm trying to remember who was head of research at that point. I'm momentarily forgetting, but I think it was right before Blanchard. But Lagarde was still the MD, managing director. My an old friend Sean Hagan was now the chief counsel, legal. And I'm trying to remember. I think this was maybe pre-Blanchard. I can double check, of course, but this was 2013.
So
because the neoclassical was completely caught out by the crisis, and of course it was central banks that were the main developers of DSGE models.
Exactly,
and they had this enormous confidence. You'd know the Smets and Wouters paper, 2007.
Yes.
And that's they're basically, yay, we've got it. This is I think I had seven variables to it, and we got the data, and it's all right. And they published it in July of 2020, July of 2007, and August of 2007. The system fell apart.
This is basically Fisher. This is Irving Fisher, summer of 1929, saying that stock prices seem to have reached a new permanently high plateau. There's something about the timing there, right?
Well, it's inevitable because they leave the causal factors that matter out of their models. They don't know that they've done that. Of course, it's not a deliberate thing by any means, but because the basic orientation of neoclassical economics is that capitalism is a barter system, and the money is just a lubricant. And if you remove the veil, as they call it, then you can see the system more clearly. So most people would think that economists are experts on money and banks and debt, and those are three things they omit from their models completely. They were totally blindsided by it.
Absolutely not. Even their latest DSG models failed quite miserably. If you look at their forecast for inflation back in 2020 and 2021, it was flat. So 2% they predict it, right? So their models haven't improved whatsoever. We got to try to do some. Hey, Robert, can you try your video now that you're closer to the?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me.
We're
gonna do a few questions here.
Okay. And the signal is looking to be strong.
I feel happy to help answer them as well, by the way, mate. It's a three-way show here.
Okay. So the first ones, we'll all take a crack at it. It is, if the U.S. government spends out of its Fed account and taxes later, so taxes don't directly fund the government, do tax receipts go back into the Fed account? Isn't the government directly spending tax revenues? Correct, but these are revenue Fed funds. And there, he's still there. These are Fed funds. So when you get taxed, you have bank credit. What your commercial bank does is they just mark down your account and that credit disappears. But the bank itself has an account with the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will mark down their Fed account and mark up the TGA, so the general account for the treasury. So in that case, yes, reserves are being swapped between bank Fed accounts and the TGA. So that's correct. So when the government's not deficit spending, they are spending pre-existing reserves. But as the economy grows, obviously the Fed participates in open market operations, and they are constantly creating new reserves as the economy grows. Steve, let's get Robert. Robert, what's your opinion on this question?
No, I think you're right. It's helpful for people to think. I mean, I guess I can't really improve at all on what you just said, Ty. I can only maybe supplement it by making some complimentary remarks. Compliment with an E rather than an I. Although I guess I would compliment with an I as well here. But maybe two things that are helpful is even when tax revenues aren't directly funding anything, you can think of tax revenues as purchasing fiscal space, right? And so the question is then always, are we maxing out the fiscal space or not? If we are, then there's going to be inflationary pressure. If we're not, fine. And that, of course, what determines that, or at least a big part of what determines that, is what federal monies are being spent upon, right? What the federal government is actually spending. Is it actually engaged in productive spending or production encouraging spending of the sort that then grows the actual production or supplies of real goods and services to the economy? Or in fact, is it just, funneling more tax cut money to billionaires who are just going to use it speculatively and thereby, sort of induce hyperinflations in secondary financial markets or tertiary derivatives markets? So one thing that's worth keeping in mind, I think, is just a kind of a general take on things that your questioner might want to sort of consider, is to think in terms of purchasing fiscal space with tax revenues rather than purchasing or spending directly on things that the government is spending on with those tax monies. Then as far as the actual mechanics and plumbing go, I think you're exactly right, Ty. I think you put it quite elegantly and quite thoroughly. One supplemental point maybe I would make is it's not a bad idea in general to think of the Fed as being related to private sector banks a bit in the way as the private sector banks are related to us as individuals. That's to say, there's a lot of shuffling back and forth, a lot of mutual crediting and debiting of banks' accounts and other government agencies' accounts within the Fed system of the same sort that's going on in a private sector bank with individuals' accounts, right? So, Ty, if you and I bank at the same bank and I make a payment to you, our bank is likely simply, right, to debit my account, credit your account at the same time. It's not going to be quite that simple. There's a bit of hoop jumping, a bit of curly queuing going on, but basically what's happening is my account gets debited, yours gets correspondingly credited. You can think of a central bank as doing something quite like that with its account holders. It's just that its account holders aren't people like you and I. They're not citizens or legal residents or whatever. They're institutions. They're basically, for the most part, banking institutions, along, of course, with the Treasury Department here in the U.S. And a few other sort of privileged entities. But essentially the same kind of thing is going on. So there's essentially a netting operation that the central banks are engaging in the same way that the private sector banks are netting when it comes to their private sector depositors. Does that sound right to you as well?
That sounds right. And Steve, I'll get you to answer kind of what Robert was saying there about creating physical space. It's quite similar to the World War II war bonds. So it wasn't to fund the war effort, it was to actually reduce consumption in the private sector. So those physical real goods would be available for consumption. Steve, kind of add on to that.
Yeah, well, you've got to look at the double entry bookkeeping, and this is where I used to be an amateur. Now I'm the second best person on the planet about the first best being the person who's hosting this show. Because Ty knows more about it than I do. But having built Ravel, originally called Minsky, the whole idea is to enable double entry bookkeeping. So, and you're seeing my screen at the moment. I'm showing how you see the financial system from the point of view of the banking sector, and this is showing like an extremely simple view of the economy, but you have households and firms. So firms pay households' wages, households consume, firms then borrow from banks They pay interest to the banks on that they've got. The government spends, the government taxes. And what you can see for the spending and tax operations of the government is the tax reduces deposit accounts, and the matching entry on the asset side is it reduces reserves. So that's like a taxation destroys money idea. But if you take a look at what happens at the bank, at the central bank, and I'm giving a talk at the People's Assembly on Monday. This is a model I put together just for them. When the reserves go down, the government's funds go up. Okay, so it's not a case that it's destroyed. The tax inflow does actually supplement the government's account there. But so long as the inflow of taxing plus bonds, which both generate revenue for the account, equals spending plus interest, this account can remain at zero, which is the way the English bank system actually operates. Every day the English system falls to zero. So the taxes they do finance government spending, but what they are doing is that they're fundamentally taking money out of circulation that's created by government spending in the first place. So if you go back to the 19th century, and this is extremely important to know your history, back in the 19th century, the average size of government spending in the United States was about 3% of GDP, which is extremely small. Nowadays about 10 times that size. So all your government spending could add money to the economy. The government spending creates money. Whether you're working in greenbacks or you're working in bank accounts. But it was only 3%. You can handle that. You wouldn't need to get rid of it because that's not going to be creating an excessive amount of money. So the spending is what determines the scale of taxing. And if you have spending of 3% of GDP, you can have tax of zero. Okay? But if you have spending of 30% of GDP, then you're going to be increasing the money supply by 30% per annum if you don't tax it out of existence. So in that sense, the taxation is dragged up by the spending, and it's the gap between the two that matters. And so it's not a case that government goes and tears up your tax receipts. That's the way that MMT people put it across when they're. Yeah, I know. It's a simplistic way of saying what actually happens, which is that the government doesn't spend out of the taxes, but if it didn't take the taxes, there'd be far too much money created, and that's what the role of taxes is, to stop that being excessive.
There's I do try to compliment the MMT crowd that bank credit is literally destroyed on tax payment.
Yeah, bank credit definitely is. Bank accounts are.
You can say because the reserves are shuffled over to the TGA, then that now it's completely outside of the commercial bank realm. That lowers a form of aggregate demand. Although we can say reserves don't really contribute that much to aggregate demand, they are part of the settlement system of private sector economics, right? And so if they're lower, theoretically, there could be less private sector activity. So I try to compliment with the that effectively the money is deleted because it's not in use for the private sector anymore. But I do try to nuance with them that the reserve balance, I like to call them settlement balances, Robert, up here in Canada where we're sophisticated, we know they're just settlement balances. They're not reserves of gold.
It's also it might be worth noting, Ty, that sort of in defense of the MMTers and other heterodox economists for that matter, that oftentimes the rhetorical emphasis is determined or at least heavily influenced by whoever it is we're sort of reacting to at a given time, right? In other words, there are very often particular misconceptions that have to be dispelled. And whichever misconceptions you decide to kind of fixate on and dispel and then act or operate sort of rhetorically against in order to dispel them, that's going to sort of influence your own rhetorical emphasis, right? And I think a lot of the rhetorical emphasis that some of our old MMT colleagues or friends or comrades in arms developed around 2009, 2010, and so forth, when they were basically confronting the Austerians in the U.S. Congress, right? The Republicans there. And so a lot of what they say now that might sound a bit exaggerated or to be in need of a bit of nuance, I think might be explicable by reference to that fact, to that sort of rhetorical birth time, so to speak. But I think given that we're kind of past that time now, and Austarianism isn't a serious threat yet, even though, of course, there is a lot of renewed talk now because of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill and its addition to deficits, it probably is time, I think, for many people to engage in a bit of rhetorical updating. And this is actually one reason I love you guys' posts so much at your site on Twitter/X, and the other your contributions to other fora is you guys never seem to get stale when it comes to the particular rhetorical emphases or the particular foci or focuses that you sort of emphasize even apart from rhetorical emphasis, right? I try to do the same, right? I try to kind of be responsive to whatever it is that's salient at the time, and then come up with metaphors or similes or examples or other kinds of emphasis or historical examples or parallels that are then relevant to that particular matter that is salient. And because that's always a moving target these days, it seems that it is kind of incumbent upon us, I think, to be sort of flexible when it comes to sort of formulating our thoughts and thinking of figuring out the best ways of communicating them to a broader public that isn't always all that financially sophisticated or informed, but quite capable of becoming so as long as they're hearing the right stuff.
And getting the right stuff into their ears is the hard part.
Yeah,
There's so much wrong stuff out there still.
Like the Keynes quote that you guys recently posted, right? Like the hard part is getting rid of the bad ideas.
Oh, bad ideas. I mean, the Keynes' old comment about madmen in authority who are distilling voices from the air are normally victims of some recent defunct economist.
Yes,
and that's so true. I mean, I'm talking at a People's Assembly in London on Monday, so it's an attempt to try a sortition approach to selecting how we could have leaders if we selected from the average public rather than having a lottery system that chose serial narcissists instead, which is what we get at the moment. So I'm starting off with a quote from Keynes say that this is. It might sound ridiculous to say that it's ideas that are leading us to making the mistakes rather than a lack of knowledge, but it's actually the wrong ideas that lead us into these traps, and they're so bad.
Yeah, and they determine what you do with the data, right? They determine what the knowledge itself looks like, or what the so-called knowledge is shaped like. Right, because the ideas are what I guess determine, what you make out of the data, and what you make out of the data are is sort of your worldview. And I guess, the bad ideas, give you a bad worldview by sort of misconstruing the data or giving you the wrong understanding of what the data themselves actually mean.
And that ends up with people thinking they can fix their models by adding financial frictions, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
As if the financial sector slows down a return to equilibrium. It accelerates a blast away from equilibrium.
Exactly.
On that note, new Keynesians are essentially friction neoclassicals. Dr. T, you can ask any question you want. It can be random. It doesn't matter. There's no structure to the show. However, I do want to get to the next part, Robert, in your career, and that was at the IMF. So what was going on there? What were your duties? What was, where were you there?
Yeah, so sort of two different phases. Sort of as mentioned before, there was the right after law school phase, and then there was the return, the prodigal return about 13, 14 years later during my first sabbatical at Cornell. The first stint there, right out of law school, was in the aftermath of the so-called Asian financial crisis.
It's 1997,
Yeah, so I was there. This was in 2000, 2001. So we're kind of in the aftermath of the 97 through 99 period. Joe Stiglitz was still the chief economist of the World Bank across the street. Michel Comte-Dessus was the managing director of the fund. And Stanley Fischer was the chief economist and deputy
somebody, of course, who trained Krugman and Olive Blanchard and Larry Summers.
Yeah.
If those are your children, there's something seriously wrong with your gene pool.
Yeah. And then, of course, long-term collaborator with Rudiger Dornbusch, right? So the whole Dornbusch-Fischer model.
Yeah.
Dan Fisher. So at that point, again, interestingly enough, they put me on something vaguely heterodox. And although, unfortunately, it ended up having a kind of a dark side, they ended up putting it to a sort of a dark side use. So the claim in the late 1990s was that there were problems with sort of inadequate financial regulation in the sort of internal domestic financial systems of some of the countries that had been affected. And so the thought was that, sort of sensible reforms of the financial systems should be made a kind of precondition of the lending of IMF funds so that they wouldn't simply be throwing good money after bad. Now, so far, so good, right? I've been quite deliberately vague there when I said some kind of financial reforms, right? Reforming those financial systems, basically regulating them in some way, because there was a perception that they had been kind of wild wests, entirely free of financial regulation, something like, say, U.S. financial markets in the late 19th century, right? So what I was assigned the task of doing is essentially determining what kinds of financial regulatory reforms would be in order for those jurisdictions in order to ensure that some modicum of financial stability could be relied upon, or could be sort of could be expected to sort of characterize those financial systems going forward, which would then render the IMF lending, not simply, a waste of time, not simply, futile. So the kinds of reforms that I suggested, interestingly enough, were not altogether unlike those which I ended up drafting into legislation for Bernie and for Elizabeth Warren and for AOC almost 20 years later. Maybe needless to say, the funds didn't end up using those. They ended up, the kinds of conditionalities that they decided to impose were more the kind of Milton Friedman type so-called reforms and the like. So, I ended up feeling ambivalently about that particular stint, because I thought, on the one hand, I'm glad that they're acknowledging that internal finance market regulatory systems or structures are important, that they actually they do play a role in generating global macro financial phenomena, right? Global macro financial dynamics. That was good, right? At least they were acknowledging that. But then when it came to the particulars, they just got it all wrong. So again, ambivalence. Second stint, 2013, 2014, what they asked me to do then was essentially what I'd been doing already at the New York Fed. It was essentially to put together the macroprudential toolkit, or to work on their version of what was to become the macroprudential toolkit. In this particular case, though, of course, it was more general than was the toolkit work at the Fed. At the Fed, I could be quite specific, right? It turns out that a lot of the microprudential tools are not that difficult to repurpose for macroprudential to achieve macroprudential ends. A case in point, for example, capital regulation, right?
Yeah.
Capital regulation has been a part of the American bank regulatory system for well over a century at this point. But the focus previously had been on the microprudential significance of that. It was in order to sort of ensure the maintenance of a buffer in order to protect the...
Oh dear.
Perhaps,
We had
Are you back again?
Am I back?
You're back.
The temporary loss,
Sorry. Am I back, guys?
You are. You're back. Yeah.
You're back.
Good. Okay. Sorry, a call came in and it just sort of screwed stuff up, and I shut it down. But anyway, so I'm actually not hearing your voices now, though. Steve, can you say
yes,
2, 3, 1?
Can you still hear
3,
me,
2,
or I'm talking, so you
man.
can't hear me?
Okay, I'm not getting your voice.
Oh dear. Okay.
So I'll tell you what. Let me finish answering the question. And then, if maybe your voice will have come back by then, and if it hasn't, we can sort of reboot. Anyway, so capital regulation here in the U.S. was originally conceived and deployed and imposed as a means of maintaining a buffer so as to protect the solvency of an individual institution. But of course, if you aggregate the capital buffers that are maintained by the various banking institutions, what you have there, in effect, is a macro buffer. And the larger the macro buffer, the less leverage, right, economy-wide, right? In other words, if you raise the required capital buffer of all of the distinct banking institutions, you're actually diminishing the total amount of leverage that is going to be permitted to be generated, at least by the banking system. You then, of course, have to look at the so-called shadow bankers as well and impose analogous buffer requirements or leverage limitation requirements on them as well. But in any event, the idea here is that that particular mechanism, right, that particular tool can be deployed in a macroprudential way, even if up to that point it had only been deployed microprudentially. And so what I did when I was at the Fed was I just sort of went through all of the distinct individual microprudential regulatory regimes that it was my job to teach students at the law school when I teach financial regulation, and essentially think through what it would be to kind of repurpose them as macroprudential tools and say what that would look like. And then, of course, propose specific language to sort of update the regs that you find in the Code of Federal Regulations, or to update the legislation in the actual code, right, the U.S. statute code, if necessary. But when it came to doing the same sort of thing at the IMF, I couldn't do that so much with specific legal provisions, of course, except for illustrative purposes. But there, you're operating at a higher level of abstraction. You're speaking in functional terms that will then have to be adapted by every member state in sort of updating its own specific set of statutory provisions or regulatory provisions or both.
Yeah. Funny, I just wanted just to...
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm still not hearing you.
That's no good. What's going on?
Steve, I'm trying to think of what I should do here. Maybe, well, do you mind, is it okay if I shut down and then just log back in? Okay, thanks.
Yeah. While he does that, I'm just going to share my screen again, because the argument that there was, nobody saw the financial crisis coming and that it was a black swan and all that sort of stuff is just nonsense. You're back again. That's good to see. Okay. So
what I'm trying to
back. Okay, I'm trying to share my screen, and each time I type the H, I get nothing. Here we go, entire screen. I want to share this one. So this is something, again, I'm presenting at the People's Assembly on Monday in London. And my argument is based on Hyman Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, has always been that there was too much private debt growing too quickly. That was causing that would cause the financial crisis, and the economy would slow down when credit turned negative. Well, I'll just actually zoom in here, and this is the American data from 1955 out to 2019, which, COVID hits and it disturbs the stats completely at that point. But you get a correlation between unemployment and the rate of growth of credit, which according to neoclassical economists should be close to zero. It's actually minus 0.42 there, which is reasonable. But the real fun is, so let's narrow it down from 55 when debt levels were quite low. Let's narrow it down to 1990 to 2015, which is when you can really see the bubble of the subprime bubble and the internet bubble causing the dynamics. That's the situation then, and you get a correlation between unemployment and credit, which again, according to neoclassicals, should be roughly zero, of minus 0.92. It is just that's not a black swan. Okay, that's a white swan biting you on the nose, and you're too stupid to see that you're being bitten by a swan. So this is what they're ignoring, and this is what's so frustrating for me, that I've shown this data so many times, and I've only had one economist ever carry on and taken any mainstream economist actually react to it. But I remember one time I showed it. I did a seminar at the Levy Institute, and of course the Levy Institute picks people who are non-orthodox, generally speaking. But there was a neoclassical, and he simply gasped. He just couldn't believe that the correlation was that high. Now that's United States. You were talking about the Asian financial crisis. Let's look at Thailand. And of course, I've got to move it back a bit for Thailand to make the range from, say, 1985 to 2000, which covers that period pretty well. And take a look at the Thai situation there. And there's the Asian, I'll actually extend it a bit so you get the fall in the debt levels more obviously. So you get a plunge in private credit, and credit went from being, hang on, that's the wrong, I haven't got the unemployment rate for Thailand. That's why the numbers are crazy. I might only, let's go for Japan. It's ever got Japan in this database. It might be my unemployment data's. Okay, so we get, there's Japan's Asian financial crisis, rising level of private debt, credit getting to being almost 30% of GDP, then it goes down to minus 15%. Unemployment falls when credit's rising and rises when credit's falling, a minus 0.87 correlation. So that's the sort of thing they're ignoring, which is why it's so frustrating to be a non-mainstreamer surrounded by mainstreamers who don't who have a paradigm that doesn't allow them to look at the data that that matters, and therefore they say there's a black swan. We couldn't.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, this is exceedingly puzzling to me, Stephen, and long has been, in that oftentimes the excuse that the mainstreamers will give, or that the orthodox will give, is they'll say that the heterodox are not very formulatable or formalizable, right? Haven't mathematized or formalized things, and so it's a little harder for us to sort of recognize clarity in their thinking, absent that. This is not a fault that can be attributed to Steve Keen, and indeed one of the things that Steve Keen is most famous for is precisely the fact that he's actually much more mathematically sophisticated than the orthodox economists, that he's actually able to do the dynamics in ways that a lot of those folk sometimes have difficulty with, unless they're doing, I don't know, calculus or something, but then they're all rocket scientists at Goldman Sachs. They're not departments, unless they're Robert Merton, somebody like that. But the thing is, so you've effectively sort of outdone them at their own game, and and maybe that's the problem, right? Maybe you've gone too far in the other direction, so that you're too sophisticated for them, so that they feel threatened by you. I'm not sure what it is, but
there's actually. Are you a fan of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
Yes, yeah, the Douglas Adams book, sure.
Okay,
yeah.
well, you'd know the section where the invention occurs of infinite improbability drive. Do you remember that little tale? Okay.
Yeah.
So you have they've invented finite amounts of improbability, which are often used at parties to move the hostess's underpants 1 meter to the left. And physicists have frowned upon this for two reasons. One, it's a very frivolous form of use of the technology, and two, they didn't get invited to those sorts of parties. But then there's a young a student who's cleaning up after a particularly unsuccessful party, and he reasons to himself that if you put a finite improbability generator into a good Brownian motion system, talking ecocalculus, say like a good strong cup of tea, this will enable you to generate an infinite improbability drive out of thin air. And he was about to receive the Galactic Nobel Prize when he was suddenly lynched by a bunch of physicists who realized what they really couldn't stand was a smartass.
Smartass, exactly. So at that point, you move on to the sequel book and you say, "So long and thanks for the fish."
Yeah. The other theory that I come up with is the only explanation I've got for the state of humanity is that, in fact, we're all descended from Golgafrinchians, except for a few random humans like you and me and Ty, who must actually be descendants of the original Homo sapiens. And it's the Golgafrinchians who can't work out how to design a wheel because they can't work out the right color for it.
Exactly. There we are. A complete absence of functional thinking.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so bloody frustrating dealing with them. The funny thing is, like, I had I didn't have the same formal relationship you had with central banks in terms of being employed by them after the crisis. But I came across to England in 2014 to work at Kingston. And then before that, I'd made a number of trips to UK for giving talks on my approach to economics. And I actually launched Debunking Economics, the second edition, at London School of Economics in 2011. And I got to be quite close to a number of non-orthodox thinkers within the research division of the Bank of England. And they were the ones who published the paper about how loanable funds is a fallacy. So there was this flowering of a bit of alternative thought, like you're saying, happened with you as well on the New York Fed in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. So from 2008 till about 2016, there were enough memories of the failure that they had that they'd caused in not seeing the financial crisis coming and telling I'd love to be able to see a politician see one of the times they would have dressed down these economists for saying what a great year 2008 was going to be.
That would be very satisfying. Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to see it. It would take me back in time so I can watch that happen. But like Bernanke's report to the Congress in 2007, July 2007, forecast growing accelerating economic growth from 2007 to 2009. And then whang, 3 weeks later, the crisis began. So, they were chastened at the time. Weirdos like you and me could get positions with them for a while, but now they seem to have fallen back into the orthodoxy again.
It happened pretty quickly. I always think a kind of a similar range of years with sort of specific symbolic demarcators that I find kind of compelling. would be sort of mid-autumn of 2008 when Greenspan testified before Congress, which is a great that Bernanke testimony just about 9 months earlier, where kind of stuttering and clearly traumatized, right? He's almost PTSD. And so there's a rare sort of show of a kind of humility or almost shame on the one hand. But then a mere, and I almost found myself feeling sorry for the guy, which is, that's pretty extreme. But then a mere, I guess maybe 6 years later, I think in 2014, he puts out that book of his called The Map and the Territory, something like that, a kind of autobiography, his kind of recollection of what had gone down 6 years earlier. And it was completely, we were right back to where we had been before, completely unrepentant, just Greenspanianism. And I thought, screw you, man. I mean, actually had me fooled there for a moment where I was actually feeling badly for you because of the kind of look of trauma on your face as you stuttered and stammered trying to get your words out before Congress. And you're just right back to being the same, swinging, that you were before.
And the same for Bernanke. I mean, Bernanke's book, Courage to Act. What a load of bollocks. Courage to Act. The bugger set up the crisis and then did... at least he threw large amounts of Fed-created money to stop the banking systems going under, but he actually set the whole situation up. And then he comes out and says, "Oh, look, I solved it." It's basically the arsonist taking credit for putting the fire out. And that's so common.
Yeah, again and again and again. It just seems to happen that way every time.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is the whole thing of a different paradigm. When you have a paradigm that's false, and it's proven to be false, but you then continue, you cling to it because it's the only way you can understand the world. And even if for a while, then you suddenly, like my image is always of how would 15th century astronomers handled if there'd been a meteor that hit Padua, and wiped out Padua. How would they explain it? Because the only explanation for meteors is they've got to come from the atmosphere because we know the heavens are perfect.
Right.
And then you've got people who go, "It was a bloody rock from outer space. Look, I've got shots of the moon. There are collisions up there. This is one that collided with us." And they'd be in disturb element for a while, but after 5 or 10 years, they'd go back and say, "Oh, there was strange clouds forming over Mount Olympus at that time, and those clouds must have been disturb the earth," and then they'd finally find a way to fit it back inside their paradigm.
And version of spontaneous generation.
Yeah, something of that nature. But this is my most intriguing. You probably wouldn't know this one because this is more microeconomics. Ben, of what's his name? Alan, pardon me freezing for a second. Blinder, Alan Blinder. You ever meet Alan Blinder?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, many times.
What's he like, by the way, as a person?
As a person, he's just exceedingly benign, friendly, unpretentious.
Yeah.
He doesn't give off in any sense, at least in my experience with him. He's never given off even the slightest hint of arrogance or complacency or, how should I put it, condescension or patronizingness. Very courtly, seemingly very open-minded and ready to hear. I oftentimes floated, kind of distinctly heterodox things with him. And he didn't seem to be merely humoring me or, suddenly look the other way and say to himself, "Don't catch his eye." He seemed really to be countenancing and thinking about what I would say, which is sort of puzzling, right? Because, of course, in other contexts, you wouldn't perhaps predict that.
Well, he became vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he was deputy president of the American Economic Association, so right up there at the top. I got the same feeling. I've never met him, but I got the same sort of feeling, with a sense of comparative humility compared to, put him next to Larry Summers. Okay, it's chalk and cheese. But he did a survey in the 1990s trying to establish new Keynesian economics over the neoclassical. And of course, the big sticking difference between new Keynesian so-called and new classical so-called is that one believes prices are sticky, which is the new Keynesian, and the other's prices are flexible. So the new Keynesian say all unemployment is voluntary, and the new classical say that, and the new Keynesian say, "Oh, there's transition periods before you return to equilibrium." So he decided to do a survey of price setting in the States. Are you aware of that work at all?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I did the whole micro
Yeah,
change.
yeah. Well, so he does the survey of 200 major corporations in the northeast quadrant of the United States,
Mhm.
responsible for 7% of the country's GDP. He worked out,
Mhm.
at any survey that takes 7% of the population is huge. Yeah?
Yeah.
And you got 89% of firms reported constant or falling marginal cost.
Mhm.
And like,
Mhm.
I'm sure it's more than that, because he and his students would have expected that to be the rising being the case. So they would have misinterpreted what a lot of the
Yeah.
manufacturers told them. But anyway, he said it was overwhelmingly bad news for economic theory, contradicts the mainstream, etc., etc. Now, I've used that for decades as a major point of where the mainstream is simply wrong. But it then occurred to me, hang on, Blinder writes a textbook. He's the guy now writes Baumol's textbook. So I thought
Mhm.
I'd take a look at the latest edition of
Mhm.
his textbook. And guess what he says about his own research in that textbook?
Uh-oh.
Have a guess.
Coming. Is
Nothing.
yeah, sort of
Sweet fuck all. He doesn't even mention his own research.
it
So he
doesn't even
explains
get
why
yeah.
doesn't even mention the fact that he's found marginal cost falls for the vast majority of firms. Instead, he just uses the same, diminishing marginal productivity argument, and he
Mhm.
makes up a firm called Al's Garages. That's his particular,
Alan
mythical
Blind.
firm. Yeah, that's Al. Al, maybe Al. It could be Al. I hadn't thought about that. You could be right. Al's Garage. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Alan,
Uh,
but he actually mangles diminishing marginal productivity. He actually
really?
mangles the definition. Yeah,
Wow.
he says that he gives the example of China and says that
Mhm.
China's obviously reached the point of diminishing marginal returns from adding fertilizer to increase food output. Now,
Uh-huh.
diminishing marginal returns only applies at a point in time. It is not
Mhm.
something which happens through time. So
Yeah.
he got that wrong, and he also said, this is hilarious because it's the exact opposite of what actually happened. He said that the so-called law of diminishing marginal returns was not a logical deduction by economists. It was, in fact, observed. Now, that's the complete opposite, okay? It
Well,
was a logical deduction, twisting Ricardo, and it
yeah,
hasn't been observed.
two words for Alan. 19th century.
Exactly,
Just
exactly.
read the
So
bloody crap, right?
I
Just
know,
read
I
the
know.
bloody stuff.
Yeah, so the classic thing is, and this is when somebody gets their paradigm disturbed, okay?
Yeah.
It's when you have there's something happens which your paradigm says cannot occur, okay?
Mhm.
Then there's two
Mhm.
possibilities.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
have a breakdown and you leave your paradigm, or you
Mhm.
find a way to
Mhm.
rationalize the event and stick with the
Mhm.
paradigm.
Mhm.
So he
It's
and
tempting.
Greenspan, all that top did that.
Yeah, I often wonder. I mean, I often wonder whether there's either a sort of a neuroplasticity problem
I think
here,
that's it. Yeah.
or a kind of aesthetic fixation. These might just be alternative descriptions of the same phenomenon, of course. But
But yeah.
there's the particular form of elegance that often characterizes their models comes, of course, at the expense of hypersimplicity, right? You oversimplify in order to get the particular form of elegance.
Ricardo's vice, if you know your Schumpeter.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
Whereas your mathematization is much more nuanced, and so it's not quite as it's not elegant in the particular way that their elegance is, right? So there's that, and that might partly account for their reluctance to sort of part with it. But there might also be just maybe there's just some kind of hardening of the arteries, as it were, in the brain.
I think that's the case. Yeah. I mean,
'Cause
yeah.
you and I seem to be able to kind of, pick up new knowledge and pick up new ways of looking at things pretty much infinitely. As far as my experience of you is that you have that kind of flexibility, you have that kind of neuroplasticity, and that's certainly my experience of myself. Although I might be self-deluded, but these folks seem really strangely wedded. It's a bit like those people who never update their faculty photographs on faculty pages, and, right? So there's like a 50-year-old faculty photograph. The
Yeah, yeah.
person's completely
I'm
unrecognizable.
tempted to do that myself these days, getting home and getting to look as I get older.
I
But yeah,
feel like I
it is mental
probably
plasticity.
do, but
Yeah. I mean, have you read any of you've read Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions?
yeah, a long time ago. Yeah,
Okay. But if you remember Max Planck, have you read any of Max Planck's
of
work?
course. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Max Planck, I mean, it talked about how he couldn't persuade his Maxwellian colleagues to accept his solution to the black body radiation problem because it meant they had to abandon the whole idea that energy is in continuous waves. And so that was just too big a gap. So it isn't just economists who do this.
No.
But I think it is a mind thing, because if you train yourself in a particular paradigm, then your mind becomes basically a system for generating that paradigm. And you get locked in a way which makes it extremely difficult for you to imagine any other way to understand that reality. Like I've been on stages with neoclassical economists on so many occasions, and the word equilibrium just keeps on popping out every 4 or 5, 4 or 5 words is equilibrium. I was actually at a Swedish meeting once, and I finally burst out laughing. They were saying, look, can I keep account of how many times you were equilibrium while you're on stage? This one kid would have said it 20 or 30 times in 5 minutes. And so if that's your mind is channeled in that way, your neural pathways are set up that way. So if you're going to, you cannot, your mind immediately reorganizes everything into having equilibrium as a central concept. And I wonder, like, partially I think I'm lucky at the age at which I had my neoclassical balls ripped off me, which was I was 18. Very, very young. I think I was 18 and 3 months, to be precise. That's the age at which a lecturer pointed out a flaw that I didn't know was there, and suddenly, bang, I just didn't take it seriously anymore. But at the same time, I wonder whether it's anything in terms of overall brain structure again, because you have to be not afraid of losing your sense of identity, your community. If you're going to jump paradigms, like Max Planck was the ultimate on that front. I think he's Planck, and you've got Planck. I put with Galileo and somebody who really did completely change a mental paradigm. So you've got to have, the amygdala has the center for fear in the brain. It may be you've got a small amygdala, or one that's not easily provoked, and that sort of thing, and therefore you can take in ideas which others are afraid of doing, because the terror. The reptilian terror thing changes you. So I sort of think that must be the case for a large number of neoclassicals and Marxists.
I can well imagine that. Yeah, certainly a lot of Marxists as well. And it's an interesting. I don't think it's a mere coincidence that the two perhaps greatest names in economic thought from the 19th and the 20th centuries both repudiated people who described themselves by using these fellows' names with then the suffix ism or ists added on, right? So Keynes, of course, notoriously or famously said, "One thing's for certain, I'm no Keynesian." But a lot of fewer people know that Marx said exactly the same thing, or the counterpart thing, about 75 years earlier. He said, "One thing is certain, I am no Marxist."
That's right. Because he actually asked a bunch of young students, what is Marxism? And they said, describe it. They said, in that case, I'm not a Marxist.
Like, what the hell? Yeah. And actually, Wittgenstein had to say something similar at one point, right? He said that the only seed that I'm likely to sow is a certain jargon. He was quite horrified, in other words, by his self-proclaimed followers who sort of used his name in vain. So there's a kind of a common theme here. It's almost, I can't remember who the writer was. There was some thinker, maybe either a theologian or philosopher, drew a distinction between those he called prophets and those he called priests. I think the article just called prophets and priests. And if we'll pardon that particular analogy, in a sense, I mean, you can sort of think, I suppose, of Keynes and Marx as prophets, right? And there's a kind of generativity when it comes to these guys, right? And but then the priests become the kind of the bean counters and the
enforcers. They enforce the new religion.
The new orthodoxy, right? And that's what we're sort of stuck with. I've often wondered, the fact that you are a motorcycling enthusiast and
no, hang on, I got to correct you there. You might leather jacket?
Yeah, I thought you were.
You don't know the story. I'm a bicyclist. I was a bicycling enthusiast. But I've got to cover the reason I wore the leather jacket actually relates to Yanis Varoufakis, another great friend of mine. You know Yanis, I take it? You met Yanis?
One time, but I can't claim to be a friend of his.
You'd get on very well. Let me just show you'd be very good friends. Yeah. Yanis, he was a leather jacket was part of his identity, because he was, and this is very typical Yanis. He got a taxi from Athens to the airport, and then from is going to somewhere in Brussels, and somehow his baggage got lost. So when he got to the place in Brussels, he didn't have any clothing to wear for the meeting. So he had to get some clothing from his host. And his host said, I've got a leather jacket and a shirt that's too big for me. So he put the shirt had to hang out for some reason, and the leather jacket was worn. Anyway, Giannis was then supposed to speak at an event in London, and I was looking forward to seeing him there. And then he wrote to me saying he couldn't make it. And I said, well, maybe I should wear a leather jacket and make up for your absence. He said, yeah, go ahead. Let's make it a meme. So suddenly I didn't have a leather jacket at all. And then suddenly I was supposed to go to this conference to be Giannis in drag, effectively. And so I rang David Graeber, who's was a very close friend. I said, David, you got to help me out here. Can you come along with a leather jacket as well? So we both went to this conference wearing leather jackets with our shirts hanging out. But in fact, that became part of my identity for a while. So I ran with it.
Oh, I love that story. I didn't realize that.
Giannis is a motorcycling enthusiast.
Okay.
I've met him a couple of times, and he's picked me up from my hotel in Athens. We've gone somewhere for a meal, and bang, it's on the back of it's probably an 850cc motorbike. So he's definitely a motorbike man.
So I'm still going to count you as sort of being of the same sort because you're a bicyclist.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I'm not a car driver. I mean, the wheels that identify me are 2 rather than 4.
Rather than 4, and I think there is a kind of maybe a certain flexibility of mind is encouraged by that, right? Because you're not sort of walled off from the world when you're in transit. You're going over lots of sort of countryside, hill and dale and the like. The kind of so-called free-spiritedness that's often just associated psychologically with people who prefer that mode of transport. And so maybe a kind of certain, again, neuroplasticity kind of comes with the territory there. I'm a bicycling enthusiast too from way back. But yeah, out here, I'm far enough away from any place where one would get groceries and the like that I kind of have to have a car as well.
Yeah.
But anywhere else, when I'm not having to get groceries or whatever, I just walk or bicycle every place, or at least that's been my tendency. I actually have to tune up my 2 bicycles at this point now that the weather is allowing one to ride. It was pretty nasty for a while there. But anyway, yeah, so I think that a lot of these folk, there's a strange kind of, it's as though their identities were determined never to change again at a particular age. And from that point on, they're just fixed points, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of.
And I've seen that with my own colleagues from university days. They've stuck in their religion and they don't move sideways. And I think it's a certain lack of fear. I mean, you'll actually try something different. I mean, there are elements in my past where I can sort of see this is like congenital with me in that sense. I remember once in my year 7 at the beginning of high school, a teacher asked me a question in the class of about 60 students, and I said, "I don't know, sir." And the teacher had his back to me, and the rest of the class said, "Keynes, you can't say that. You got to give him an answer." I said, "Look, I don't know."
Yes, yeah. I've got a counterpart to that, which is that this started a long time ago. Sometime in my 20s, it occurred to me that I don't actually have to have an opinion on everything.
Yeah, exactly. You can be. You say, I don't know. Tell me, what do you think? Is there's not an unreasonable answer to a question?
Is this something I should be concerned about? What would you recommend that I read to sort of get into it, or where would you recommend that I look in order to kind of learn? Because at the moment I don't feel equipped to opine because it's not been a thing, as to use the current idiom, it's not been a thing to me up till now. And in consequence, I haven't read anything one way or the other on any side of, if there's a controversy, I haven't read anything on any side of it. So what do you recommend that I look at? Who do you think the best sort of contrary thinkers are to your own position? Who do you recommend I look at for other takes on this? And then if it seems like the stakes are high enough, or that it should matter enough to me, then I'll sort of investigate further. But if not, then I won't, and I'll just sort of think, I feel a great deal more serenity if I don't have an opinion on something that I don't feel like I need to have an opinion on, and that I therefore don't have to keep abreast of, and I think that's very liberating too. And it actually kind of saves mental bandwidth, right, for sort of more focus on what actually does matter to you, or what you think ought to matter to people, That I think also lends itself maybe to a certain degree of mental flexibility too, right? Because I think I have fewer fixed points that I have to accommodate when I'm arriving in a position on something else. You know what I mean? In other words, let's imagine that there's a finite bandwidth that can be given over to the formation of a worldview. And imagine the worldview would then involve positions on, I don't know, geophysics, astrophysics, macroeconomics, microeconomics, monetary theory, political theory, and all manner of other things. Well, the more positions I suppose you have in, and the greater number of the sort of subspaces within which you have those positions, I suppose the more constrained you might be when it comes to formulating a new position in some field that you don't yet have a position in, because it has to be in some way coherent with or consistent with all those other positions that you've already got. And maybe people experience a constraint of that sort in some way. I suppose that this is a long-winded way of saying maybe people have ideologies. And maybe if you sort of minimize, right, the number of things that you consider yourself automatically to have opinions on, the less ideological you are in a certain sense of that word.
And the more logical, what we desperately need. We're getting, speaking of logic, we're getting questions here from the questioners asking if they can ask a question. So Ty, do you want to come back and be host for a while here? Because we've got Dr. T on Mercia.
You know what? It's like listening to a therapy session there.
Which one of us? Are we
I'm
both
gonna
on
be
the couch?
quite frank. You guys are both, and it was like war stories because you guys are like veterans compared to me. Sorry, guys. Like I'm younger and prettier and all that stuff.
Definitely prettier. Yeah.
But it was like listening to two grandpas talk about their war stories. There, I just had to let it go on for quite a while. Like that evolved from Alan Blinder to Steve being in 7th grade and telling the teacher he didn't know what the hell was going on. That was something else. We have some questions.
From Terry rather than Dr. T. Yeah.
From Terry instead of Dr. T. Well, there's so many. What one did you see, Steve, that you liked?
Mm-hmm.
What one did you like, Steve?
It's too low. I'm only seeing a small sample of the questions.
Okay,
here,
let's see. I saw one here that I wanted to comment on, and it was about basic income and a job guarantee, which are both progressive things.
This is one point I think that's raising something that Robin and I are talking about. In fact, people's inflexibility, inability to imagine that you can actually combine the two. So read the question now, Time. We'll run from there, all three of us.
Yeah, so the question is, MMT folks talk about government as an employer of last resort in tough times. Guaranteed basic income is also bandied about. Is either preferred or maybe both? I'll answer the question, and I'll be a little bit nuanced with it. And I'll start with the like a federal job guarantee. So I don't know. There's quite a few different versions of it and ideas. So my concerns to start with a federal job guarantee is who owns the means of production for the capital, the fixed capital that provides these jobs. So it's one thing for the government to say, okay, we've got this buffer of equipment and these people that are unemployed, and we can put them to work, whatever it might be, helping old people digging ditches. Every job in the economy requires some capital equipment. That capital equipment depreciates over time. Who covers the cost of depreciation during booms, right? That's a cost. And we have to ask, okay, is that equipment really is it making society better? Who decides if that equipment is making society better, right? And also, as if it's defined as like different regional councils that decide, okay, in this region we need these type of jobs, and we're going to administer a federal job guarantee, and we'll get federal funds to administer it. So those are the problems I have with a federal job guarantee. Mainly is who really owns the means of the production. Is it the government? Do they own the shovels and the trucks or whatever equipment? Or is it the private sector that owns it and they get funds from a federal job guarantee program to employ people during slumps? Those are my problems. Now, I'm not opposed. What I would really like is a federal job training program. Okay, so we're training individuals to function in the private sector. and giving them long-term tools to really thrive in whatever industry they might be interested in. So I'm more interested in federal job training as opposed to here's a job until times get better and then back out into the workforce you go. And obviously, I know there's a lot of nuance to the federal job guarantee from a lot of MMT folk. As for a basic income, I'm a little more supportive of it because, despite what the detractors say, oh, it could be inflationary. You have to remember that income becomes profits for firms, and generally, firms take profits and they increase their capital stock base, which allows for more output, which of course reduces the chance of inflation because you just have simply more goods and services in the economy, which also employs people, right? And it's far less administratively taxing. For instance, the government can just give out the funds and let the free market decide what the efficiency of those funds going through the system is. So that's kind of my opinion there. Now, there's drawbacks in that. We obviously know that firms, private sector firms on their own don't always look out for the benefits of society as a whole. So obviously, there's issues with that, and there is the issue is how much per month, let's say, or how much per year or per quarter do you actually give for a basic income. Now, if you can look at that in a future where we've got a climate crisis emergency, maybe a basic income is really good because we keep people at home and they're not actually emitting more CO2 into the atmosphere. There's that nuance. I will say we had Troy, I can't remember his last name. Troy Cochrane. He's a Canadian economist, and he suggested that it's a triad of systems that we should focus on all three, which includes basic services. Now, this isn't a big deal in Canada, but it is down in the States where you guys don't even have basic healthcare to any meaningful degree. Versus Canada. And obviously, there's inefficiencies and wait times in Canada. But trust me, I can go break my leg and I won't be $10,000 in debt tomorrow. I'll be just fine and I'll get some unemployment insurance and life will go on. And then we should also have some sort of a job guarantee program, but very nuanced, right? So it's very intensive on training, right? Giving you the skill sets to participate in the private sector as an employee, and you can thrive for the rest of your life, even if there's a future slump in the economy. And also that there would be some sort of basic income, right? It could be guaranteed for everybody, et cetera, et cetera. Another big nuance between a basic income and a federal job guarantee is a basic income lessens the dependence on a deficit, right? So it advocates that there's a high income tax rate on the highest earners in the economy. So they suggest a little less deficit spending. I'm kind of with Troy on it, that it should be a nuanced approach between all three, not just one. And that one is not mutually exclusive, right? You can have all three if that's what you want to do as a nation, if that's what you desire. As what did Keynes say? Anything we can do, we can afford, right? And essentially, that's the crux of Troy's argument: is that we can do these things, we can afford it. Do we want to do it, right? And that's what it really comes down to.
It's also, I mean, I sort of, you get quite strong fights between MMT, job guarantee advocates, and universal basic income advocates. And I watch them saying, look, why are you fighting each other? The thing I don't like about universal basic is the universal, because when you speak to some advocates of it, they think you can get everybody the same amount of money. And then that will make everybody, work more effectively. But the thing is that potentially can just increase the price level. It doesn't. Everybody gets. If you get to everybody at a certain point in time, then you are potentially causing an inflationary surge and not actually enabling more real goods to be produced. So I prefer what's actually mentioned here by Dennis, which is a guaranteed basic income, and then an employer of last resort income, and being fully employed. And I'm quite happy to see anybody getting a guaranteed basic income gets less than somebody who's on a job guarantee, and a job guarantee be less than what you get working in the private or public sector as a full-time employee. I think they're compatible in that sense. There's a way to work it out, but there's so much fighting that goes on over these issues, and it's the fighting itself that starts to get me down.
Same here. I always think of this as a classic case of what Freud called the narcissism of petty differences. Even
Yeah.
not terribly petty, but nevertheless, I mean, they're mutually complementary. I've always thought as well, and so I've never really got why there's a struggle or some sort of, let alone a sort of existential titanic struggle. The one thing I'll add here is a lot of the work that I've focused on. I mean, a lot of the work that I've been doing of late over the last, my gosh, even when I was a grad student, I was doing this, is to focus on essentially a move away from capitalism, as I'll under a particular definition that I'll give in a moment, to what I'll call laborism, which I'll also define. So one way to define, there are lots of different ways of defining or understanding capitalism, usually understood in terms of who owns the means of production. A very closely related but slightly differently focused definition would be to say you look at a unit, a productive unit. We'll just call the firm, as orthodox economists call it, and you ask, all right, what do control rights in the firm track? Under capitalism, your control rights in the firm track your so-called capital contribution, which is just to say your money contribution.
Yeah.
The more money you put in, typically in the form of equity investment, in some cases in the form of debt or convertible investment, the more control rights you have. What I would call laborism would simply track the amount of labor that you put in, right? The more hours of labor that you put into the firm, the more control rights, the more governance power you have within the firm. And the firm would finance itself then when it comes to, sort of the sort of purchase of capital equipment and the like, would come through borrowing money, right? Rather than selling equity stakes, right? Now, in the past, of course, one reason that I think capitalism, as I've defined it, sort of became the dominant mode in the 19th century, is because in the 19th century, owing to problems of state capacity and technical capacity, we lived under conditions of capital scarcity. And so you had capital, in effect, calling the shots, right? There was labor abundance before very long and capital scarcity, especially in Europe, but even after a while in the US. We no longer live under conditions of capital scarcity if we attend to the public source of our finance capital. If we at least attend to the capacity of the public, now that we have state capacity and technological capacity, the capacity of the state to determine the availability and indeed the allocation of credit money, i.e. finance capital, right? So there's no reason then not, right, to start engineering a steady conversion away from capitalism to laborism, to, in other words, labor-owned firms. 3 books that I've got out this year are sort of, among other things, focused on that. The first, the Spread the Fed book, which came out in January, includes consideration of all of that, even though the focus is different. Another book that's literally just came out on the 11th, just a few days ago, and that Steve kindly blurbed, and that I have Steve's actual diagrams that he showed you earlier in as appendices. This one's called Making Capital Democratic.
Okay.
Is sort of focused on that as well, or at least pays a good bit of attention to that as well. But then a third book that I have coming out later this year, it's called A Republic of Producers. That'll be coming out with Yale University Press. That one is entirely about this. It's about how to financially engineer a wholesale conversion of all of the productive sectors of the economy over from capitally owned firms, or capital owned firms, I should say, to labor owned firms, or at the very least, labor co-determined firms, and sort of how to do that, and showing sort of how easy it is to do that once we recognize the public character of by far the greater part of our finance capital. Oh yeah, there we are. That's the one that's just come out, and that's got a lot of Steve Keynes in it. So since it's up there, thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Robert.
Thank you for your contribution to that book. I mean, that was wonderful. I remember, just because I'm getting sentimental here, I got Steve's sort of extensive comments on this last August, and it was just after having been over in Athens at a conference, a big academic conference. So I was in Giannis's territory. Then I get back to the States, and I get the Polity Press tells me, hey, we've got all the commentary, the recommendations from Steve Keynes. Read all of those through, made all of those changes, welcomed them, and then incorporated a lot of reference diagrams. So Steve fans might like this book as well, because there's a good bit of Steve in it.
It's again, it's the plasticity thing. If people seem to get locked onto one, that's the cure, and anybody else who puts an alternative is from a different tribe, and I've got to fight them, rather than saying what are the ways in which these ideas can be compatible, or can enhance each other. But the one thing, like the two things I want to ask about the labor form thing. First of all, I imagine you talked about the institutions like Mondragon.
Yes, of course.
And also, the Gore-Tex, even though they're very capitalist, they've set themselves up to be, so each individual unit obeys the Dunbar number. You have no more than 150 people in each, which is recognizing humanity in that sense. So you do talk about, how was Mondragon growing as a very much a labor-dominated system? I remember seeing claims all the time that it's growing on average faster than the rest of the global economy. Is that still true?
I don't think it is. I might be wrong about that, Steve. But the last I was the last time I spent considerable time with it, it was, I think it had kind of normalized. And, kind of it. Once you kind of get over the initial sort of growth spurt that comes with some new way of doing things, or some new industrialization from a position of non-industrialization. Once you get past that kind of growth spurt, or that initial kind of, I guess what the old Rostovians would call takeoff, then growth rates become, a little bit more humble. But nonetheless, it was robust. As I recall, it was probably a little higher than average global growth rates, but not higher than the average growth rates of certain countries like China, for example.
Yeah, well, which brings up the next little question. Two questions are fundamentally: to what extent do you see China as having more, being closer to the laborism than capitalism, as you're describing it?
Yeah, it's funny. China is a really difficult place to say one thing about and feel confident about it. I mean, you talk about neuroplasticity and system plasticity. I mean, the effervescence of Chinese economy and society right now is just, it's a beautiful sight to behold. I mean, to adopt the old Burkean distinction between the sublime and the beautiful, this is sublime.
Wow.
In other words, it's not sort of simple and therefore symmetrical and beautiful in that sense. It's sublime in the sense that there's a kind of a titanic, volcanic effervescence to it. And so it's very protean, and lots of things are happening and lots of things are changing all the time. And to make it even more, to sort of make the case even more poignant, this is all sort of multi-sectoral, right? So different sectors are sort of changing pursuant to sort of different patterns, and they have different sort of effervescences about them. So it's almost like one of those old variety show skits where somebody has, got plates spinning on sticks that are standing on his head and on his fingertips and on his knees and his elbows. There's just so much going on at one time. If you want a nice on the ground compelling example for ejecting the very concept of equilibrium as an organizing principle, just think of China. Like, how would you ever equilibrate, even in even the most ambitious of Walrasians would just balk at the idea of a general equilibrium among all of these sectors, with every single one of them being so that's all of that is the throat clearing. That's the kind of the disclaimer before I say what I'm going to say, which is still going to be pretty trivial. And that is that there's a lot of experimentation, it seems to me, from what I see when I look at the firm and the way that the firm is organized. A lot
in China, with
sort of different ways through which one might empower or make central to the actual governance and the actual decision making that happens when it comes to what to produce and how to produce it. A lot of different forms, including property forms, that are being experimented with in China, all of which have only one thing in common, it seems to me, and that is indeed to ensure a maximal use of what we can call, I suppose, the cognitive resources of the people themselves, right? In other words, there's the old what was it called? The United Negro College Fund used to have this slogan. That was the name of it. Used to have the slogan, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." China seems to be a place that really has taken that maxim.
When was the last time you were there, by the way?
It's been a long, long, long time. I was supposed to be there quite recently, and then COVID kind of dashed it. I was to go there. I was to spend considerable time there in 2019.
Okay.
But I do, the exposure that I have now is through various friends and colleagues with whom I'm on WeChat.
Oh, yeah.
So we're sort of in constant touch about what's going on. But when it comes to actually being on the ground, looking around, I have to go again soon because it's been a while since I've been there on the ground. And so I'm basically just going on what friends tell me on WeChat.
I'm looking for them. I haven't been since 2017, so I've got the same issue. I want to see, because the rate at which it's changing is so rapid, and the confidence that's coming out now.
Yeah.
That's such a shift from what I first experienced 40 years ago when I went there in my late 20s, I think it was. It was so dominated by the Mao period. Everybody was terrified of saying something which was outside what was acceptable, and you've still got that extent to which you don't want to, say something that provokes Z, or you don't want to get a bad social credit score and things of that nature. But generally speaking, the freedom to behave as you wish to behave, while having a sense of collective identity as well.
Yeah.
That seems quite remarkable, and I do want to see the fun that they seem to be having compared to the angst that seems to be the normal state of the West these days. It's quite a remarkable difference.
There seems to be a remarkable so first off, just to sort of, again, by way of disclaimer, it's been even longer for me. It's been a decade for me, Steve. And the last time I was there, it was Hong Kong, which is not exactly represented.
No.
Right.
No, not Hong Kong now. You got to go to Shanghai or Sichuan or
So I was supposed to be in both Wuhan and Shanghai in 2019, and then that ended up getting dashed. It was going to be late 2019, and then of course, as you know, COVID began to sort of turn up in late. So all of that got dashed, and I haven't got over there since then, and so I have to get back on the ground. But as best I can tell through WeChat chats with various friends, most of whom are either academics or banker types, finance types, there's a kind of a really refreshing, there's a freedom from any kind of dogmatism, as far as I can tell, at least, which is, I think would really surprise a lot of Americans, right? Because the dogma among Americans is that's dogma central over there, right? That it's basically just North Korea with more people. They're all zombies. Right,
more people and less dogs.
And nothing could be more different. I mean, there's much more creativity, much more flexibility of mind, and much more, therefore, just a sense of kind of both cognitive and existential freedom, at least among the people I'm in conversation with, than almost any Americans that I know, right? And again, I think that would surprise. That would, was it Bob Dylan? It would blow their minds most bitterly. I think it would blow many people's minds most bitterly. At first, the first hint I got of this, by the way, was when we had a sort of a joint conference with a bunch of Chinese academics on the one hand and Cornell academics on the other, about 15 years ago, and we had them all here at Cornell, and so the department head, the dean of this law school, this Chinese law school, of course, was a member of the party, and a fairly important official who's a member within the party. The faculty members, in turn, including the junior faculty members, were not necessarily members of the party, although some might have been. But we would socialize a lot between presentations, so lunch, dinner, and so forth. And very oftentimes, the mere professors, especially, and even the assistant professors, the new sort of first year professors, would tell quite irreverent jokes about the party, about the hierarchy, about the government, and even about their own dean. And then anytime they would make a kind of snarky but good-natured remark about the party, they would add a joke. They'd say, "Oh, we better be quiet. The dean is here with us." And they'd look at him, and then they'd all start laughing, and the dean would laugh too. This is not North Korea, as far as I know. Maybe North Korea isn't North Korea either, but basically, but I have no idea. I just don't know.
I haven't been to North Korea. I've been to Cuba.
But I mean, the stereotype of it, is very much the stereotype of China. It seems to me, among lots of Americans, and I've not. I mean, basically, in my experience, for what it's worth, and it's limited, of course, but in my experience, Americans are much closer to being North Koreans than any Chinese who might,
Absolutely. The
right?
extent to which there's a defined way to think about the world. It's capitalism as Americans define capitalism is the
Yes.
only system that has any merit. We're free. It's freedom to aspire rather than freedom to be able to walk down the street without being mugged.
Yes.
Things of that nature.
Yeah.
So it's remarkable how doctrinaire the Americans are, and
Mhm.
it's in some senses a sense of projection. They project that onto what they see as their biggest rival.
Yeah.
And
Classic.
the thing they're having a hard time explaining, if they're doctrinaire, why are they growing 5 times faster than we are?
Yeah.
Which is roughly the ratio of per capita growth on average over the last 40 years between the two countries is
Yeah.
that China's growing 5 times faster.
Yeah.
Which is, I think now I really wonder whether, like, the rate of doubling being that if you look at just in terms of per capita growth rates, and I'm no guarantee they're going to continue at this level, but
Right.
if you did maintain that gap for another 10 years, China would be twice as much wealthy as it is now. America would be 1.1, 1.2 times as wealthy. And you probably have China having a higher per capita income level. And it's not all down to per capita income. It's down to the fact that they have, the opposite of what Galbraith used to call private affluence and public squalor. They
Yeah.
have public affluence and
Mhm.
private comfort, it seems,
Yeah.
for
It's
most
that way.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's amazing too. I mean, people probably would be surprised to know that in this, this communist country is, and on the American view of communism, that home ownership rates at this point
90%.
they're eclipsed. They've eclipsed U.S. home ownership rates, and we were supposedly the great yeoman republic, right? The
Yeah.
smallholder, right? The freeholder, where everybody owns their own homestead, and we're so far from that now, especially post-crisis. Now that private equity firms own everybody,
Yeah.
and now that Goldman Sachs is the world's largest absentee landlord here in North America, it's not really Goldman Sachs; it's actually BlackRock. But now that all of that has happened, I think a lot of Americans, again, it would blow their minds most bitterly to know that home owning in China is a much more robust thing. They are the yeoman republic, the people's republic.
That's right.
The yeoman republic. And I think this is just, we have not updated our sort of knowledge bases, right? We've still got this image nicely encapsulated, of course, by J.D. Vance's reference to the peasants of China. Seems to be like the China of, I don't know, 1880 or something. I mean, the Opium War has just
Certainly,
taken
like
place.
1980. I mean, like that was my first experience of China, 81, 82, and it was a peasant
Yeah.
society,
Yeah, the
and
War has just begun.
the like I went to one village in Sichuan. I took a bunch of journalists for a tour of China in 81, 82, and we went through Sichuan. And the reason they took us to Sichuan was they hoped the journalists would promote the area because there'd been a serious flood, so they wanted to get some overseas aid and so on. And walking through one of the villages, and I noticed how strange the little children looked. And I finally asked one of the social affairs journalists with us. I can't think of Jane's last name, but she was the only female in the group from the Australian side. And I said, I think these kids have got Quakashaw.
Wow.
And she had a quick look around and said, I think you're right. They've all got these distorted faces that comes out of protein deficiency. So that was, and this is part of the whole political system of China as well, because back in the old days, you had the pro-grain and the pro-protein, pro-grain and pro-protein and pro-carbohydrate. This is how agricultural the society was. So you'd have the top group would be the grain group. That would say promote grain. That would come down to the local province, and the Communist Party official would respond to it by ripping up protein crops and planting grain. There'd be a bountiful grain harvest coming out, not enough protein. The kids would be born distorted. The peasants would look at it, riot, and go and kill a few of the local communists. That would go back up the command chain. The peasants are revolting. That would flip the dominant group at the Communist Party. You'd go to a pro-grain group, a pro-protein group, and they would then send the directive down, and the people would then rip up grain crops and grow protein. And that sounds hypothetical, but the reason I know it is real is that we went to Shanghai. We met with the mayor of Shanghai and a guy whose title was literally translated as the economic boss of Shanghai. And we got some data before we got out there showing that there'd been a 17% increase in light industry, as they called it, and a 7% fall in heavy industry. This didn't make sense to us. So we've asked everybody, never got a decent answer until this guy asked them the question. He said, we followed the directives of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And I said, well, what were those directives? And they said, well, they were to promote light industry. So what did you do? And this is a quote, translated, but this is a quote. We stripped heavy industry factories and turned them into light industry.
Oh, wow. Ah, right.
Now
right.
that's the sort of mindset that people still think is China. Okay, and that was true 40 years ago. But the transformation that's occurred since then, starting as under Deng, of course, and now with the sort of rampant capitalism that it is, with central politics and distributed economy, it's a totally different world.
It really is. I mean, it's even it makes the growth miracle in a way even more impressive, right? That it's happened in the last 40 years, because I think people forget, right, that the first 40 years of the People's Republic in many ways was a kind of continuation of the Ming period, the Manchu period, the Tang period, the multiple periods before that, with the classic pattern of periodic peasant revolts, then shook everything up because those who were in the metropoles or those who were in the urban centers of power were ignoring them, to the point where things reached a breaking point. And so there was a kind of constant cycling all the way up, it seems, up until the late 1970s. And then you really got on a new path. It seems sort of a path that at least they stayed on. It really does seem to have begun in the late 70s, early 80s. And what that means then is that this astonishing transformation that we've seen, it's not happened even like since 1950 or something like that. It's
since 1980.
That's immensely impressive, right?
It is. It's the most impressive growth performance, or technological and social advancement performance in the history of humanity. I think.
Humanity, right? And it's the only possibility I can imagine for anything coming to rival that in future is if Africa manages to get its act together, in the sense that you get actual unity among the various African countries. And that's a real long shot. But I could imagine the second half of the 21st century becoming a kind of African century, given current population growth rates and the sort of the spread of a kind of intellectual capital. I mean, I'm sort of, again, I'm extrapolating massively here, but the students whom I have now, who are from countries like Zambia and Ghana, and other Central African countries in particular, are so unbelievably impressive in their capacities on the one hand, and their personalities as sort of, again, flexibly minded, seriously socially oriented people on the other hand, that I often think, if the institutional organizational capacities of that continent evolve in such a way as to enable cross-border collaborations and a kind of a unification of Africa, with Chinese capital going in, with that isn't conditional in the same way that U.S. capital in the past. I could imagine something quite miraculous happening there too. But I think the obstacles, of course, are formidable, just as they were for China circa 1980. So
and they don't have the commonality. China has common language, and the common script, obviously different languages, common script. And the cultural background, the history of being, as Marx used to talk about them being the Asiatic mode of production, which was really focused around centrally created irrigation systems to enable the land to be as fertile as it was, given the constraints of space and the pressure of people. So on that front, I can't see the Africa making that transition. I'd love to be wrong.
It would definitely be a greater leap forward, so to speak, if it were to happen. But being as metabolically optimistic as I am on the one hand, and being as impressed by the students I keep having coming in on the other, I'm hopeful about it. But we'll see. But either way, I mean, it's quite clear that China represents a new kind of hope for humanity that I think a lot of people outside of China seem really strangely reluctant to acknowledge. Right. And Americans in particular ought to be capable of appreciating this, at least if we had any historical sense left, right? Because the growth model in many ways is quite comparable to the Hamiltonian growth model, right? The role of the state on the one hand and so-called private sector on the other. There are similar, I mean, the Chinese is much more impressive even than the Hamiltonian, but as far as the sort of general vibe is concerned, or the general idea of a kind of a combined public-private, with each sector, so to speak, specializing in that which it has a comparative advantage in or is best In other words, taking subsidiarity seriously. You would think that Americans' intellectual history would have equipped them to be able to appreciate the achievement, and not only that, but sort of how and why it has worked. But again, we don't. Our historical memory now goes back no further than 8 seconds. The last tweet that we read, I suppose.
Unfortunately,
There's sort of no capacity any longer, it seems, or very little capacity any longer. It seems for Americans to sort of appreciate not only how impressive the Chinese achievement is, but also how recognizable it ought to be to an American who properly understands how the American growth miracle happened back when it did. Michael is a rare case in point of an American who kind of gets this, right?
Michael Hudson,
Another friend of yours, of course, I know, but very, very few Americans seem to get this, and it's very surprising to me because it really is a kind of, it's a weird it's almost like a throwing away of your own patrimony. It's a throwing away of your own inheritance, because that's one bit of the American inheritance that we could, in theory, be proud of. There's not a lot, but that's one that we could. But it's all China's now.
Indeed.
Right.
We've got to wrap up if we tie. I think we're tracked to 2 hours.
Yeah, we have. Thanks, Robert. It was fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for sitting in. Thanks for sitting in your car for 2 hours.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. And thank you guys for your patience with the strange internet glitches there for a while. I'm glad we reached. Sorry for this word.
Equilibrium.
For a while.
Let's go to harmony. Okay, let's use a more Chinese word.
Yeah, harmony or consilience or geomancy. We'll use one of those synonyms.
There you go.
We finally got to that. Thanks for putting up with the craziness.
How are you coping, by the way, with the politics in the States right now? Are you under any threat in terms of security as an academic?
I haven't experienced a direct threat, but I'm very much aware of the prospect of it, or the possibility of it. And I've recently discovered that I'm now being followed on social media by some administration officials.
Oh shit! Yeah,
which sent a little bit of a chill down the spine. So I'm not unaware of danger or concern. And the one reason I remain relatively hopeful and not too worried, apart from again the usual metabolic optimism, is I can't imagine that I'm important enough for them to spend scarce resources on. On the other hand, now that the big beautiful bill is passed and they've ICE or whatever has a much larger budget than it had before,
it's a little money to spare for you.
For them to pay attention even to small fry like me. So I'm not quite as I don't feel quite as cavalier maybe now as I did before the passage of the bill, but I guess we'll see it. But it definitely feels very strange, very
That's weird. I'm not going to go to the States for the next 4 years. I don't want to get grabbed get my phone grabbed at customs and find myself in El Salvador.
Yeah, I've had family in Canada for a while, and I can't imagine asking any of them to visit the States. I would only go north, and even if I went north, I'd only go on the with some plans in place that would enable me to deal with it if I weren't able to get back in to the so that's kind of where we are now. I'm hoping, who knows? I mean, all the Epstein stuff is beginning to there certainly does seem to be a crack sort of appearing in the foundation of the administration. So maybe things will change. I guess we'll see. But
it's still only the first year, so let's hope that is the case.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, great to see you, mate. Thank you very much for coming on and being a good friend.
Oh yeah, thank you guys for being such great friends, and it's so good to see you again. And we'll be in touch soon. And again, thanks for putting up with all the internet craziness out here in the sticks at the beginning.
And hopefully, get to Europe somewhere we can actually have a good conversation over here too.
Yeah, let's.
And Canada, Keynes in Canada, in Vancouver, the other side of the country, but pretty easy to get.
We're planning to build a wall up here and make the Americans pay for it. We're working on it.
Good. It's just as long as you let me come on through. You can please kiss up to Mark Carney for me. We have met from back when he was a central banker. I do, at least as central bankers go, I think he's one of the less objectionable ones.
Yeah.
So he actually, a lot of people have forgotten his history during 2008 as managing Canada quite well through that crisis, and hence why he got a job with the BOE because of his success with the BOC.
We
Yeah,
talked about
yeah.
him all the time when I was at the Fed and at the IMF. He was the central banker in those days, and it's hard not to feel a certain residual admiration and appreciation of him for that. He's not as lefty as I am, but you can't have everything.
For a central banker, he is
That's
for
central
for a
banker.
central banker, he is quite far to the left,
Yeah.
which to
Yeah.
a progressive isn't that far, but for a central banker,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the way I view him, and I'm perfectly happy to flatter the hell out of him if he'll let me. Actually, it turns out, this is just one quick aside. It turns out that because of where my grandfather was born, I apparently qualify for Chinese Freudian slip there. I apparently qualify for Canadian citizenship, so I could actually apply at any point now, and I'm now entitled to it owing to a recent High Court decision because my grandfather was born in Quebec. So
Okay.
I might end up having to make use of that privilege. But Steve, I've also been I've got a standing invitation to be over at Lund in Sweden, so I might end up over there at some point. The main thing is I have to make sure that if I do go over there, I'm prepared to stay in the event that I can't come back for a while.
Yeah, that's one of the dangerous things. Yeah.
That's the when it comes to planning travel, that's the main thing I'm having to
I think most of us are going to be staying put for that reason most of these next few years.
Yeah.
All right, guys, I'm going to have some dinner over here. So great to chat. And,
okay. Thank you, guys. See you soon.
Thank you.
Again. Okay.
Bye.
See you again. Okay.
You are now relearning economics.